Okay, there's the link for anyone who wishes to do it. You can always type exclamation point paper, and if you're watching this later on the YouTubes, it will be in the link will be in the show notes underneath. Okie dokie, here we go. And this will go, it should be half the time because it's half the length, and that's not how anything works. All right. Most writers on the ethics of belief adopt some version of evidentialism, roughly the view that one should limit one's belief to the evidence one has for their truth. More truth talk. Okay, William James, particularly in his paper The Will to Believe, has traditionally been seen as a critic of evidentialism, with his claim that our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must, decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot be, by its nature, decided on intellectual grounds. Okay, so basically, you have to use your passions to figure stuff out when you don't have a logical reason, I guess you might say, for choosing one or the other. So being understood as saying that in certain cases we have the right to believe beyond what is certified by the evidence. So there's an interesting phrase right here. Belief beyond what is certified by evidence. So we've already got like evidence and certification and whatever the heck that means, but whatever. However, there's an alternate expansive reading of James that portrays him not as criticizing evidentialism itself, but only as trying to expand our conception of what we should count as evidence. For instance, Scott Aiken and Robert Talese argue that the kind of cases James supports, kind of cases James supports his view are not exceptions to evidentialism, but rather involve a pragmatist expansion of the concept of evidence. And in her The American Pragmatists, Cheryl Mizak argues what James was trying to do was not to refute evidentialism, but rather to expand the concept of what can count as evidence for the truth of a belief. One of the ways in which James wants to expand the concept of evidence is to include evidence as the satisfaction of the believer. Okay, so this is interesting in some sense. Like, a lot of times when you're talking about truth, you're talking about things out in the world, but now you're also saying there's something either psychological or otherwise within you that can be given as evidence. Sometimes people use imagination as a basis for belief or knowing things. So like if you can imagine certain situations, like say you imagine something very, very bad and you say, well, I don't know it's bad, but I believe it's bad because when I imagine it, I feel terrible. And so in some sense, just by imagining, there's nothing in the world, but there's something within you that gives you more information than you had before. So that would be a way of using both your imagination and your feeling, your revulsion of it, to gain new knowledge. I don't know if I agree with these things, but I've seen this claim before that like you can learn something by what you're repulsed by and what you can imagine. Okay, while this expansive reading of James has become increasingly prominent, the prima facie case against it is obvious. If James had wanted to expand the concept of evidence, he could have said so. And while he often speaks of beliefs legitimately going beyond the literal, scientific, or objective evidence, he never goes on to say that they managed to do so based upon non-literal, non-scientific, or non-objective evidence. Indeed, he never describes the passional contribution to belief as evidence, and as Mizek's suggestion that James wants to broaden the scope of intellectual grounds so that they include the passional sits ill with his canonical statement above, which states that the passional contribution is licit precisely in cases which cannot, by their nature, be decided on intellectual grounds. Yeah, it looks like they're trying to read into him something they want him to say, not what he explicitly said. He may have believed it, but he definitely didn't look like he claimed it. So what would motivate the expansive reading? I'll be focusing on two strategies here. The first internal approach relies on showing that the logic of James' argument itself relies on highlighting a new type of evidence rather than undermining the need for our beliefs to be grounded in evidence, while the external approach appeals to aspects of James' biography to show that he always intended something closer to the expansive reading. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Like, we're going to talk about what counts as evidence and that overall James did believe in an expansive reading, even if he never explicitly said so. The internal argument, doxastically efficacious beliefs. How did we get back to More epistemology. Ay, ay, ay. The internal argument for the expansive reading of James has two steps. The first is to argue that James' criticism of evidentialism are limited to doxastically efficacious, that is, cases where believing P can contribute to the ultimate truth of P. The most famous instance of this being his mountain climber, whose confidence in his ability to make the leap contributes to his success in doing so. So believing P can contribute to the ultimate truth of P. That's a weird claim, actually. Why would belief matter to the way things are in the world? Anyway, the second step is to argue that in such cases, our awareness of this efficacy allows us to count our belief that P as evidence for its truth. What's up, Cryonics? How you doing? Aiken and Talese present a clear case for this strategy. Okay, we're reading a question about how did William James see evidence for knowledge. Cryonics. Anyway, so we're going to say how narrow or expansive could you use like internal psychological states in some sense as things to make things true in the world. Okay, as Richard Gale terms it, the subject makes a knowing self-induction. However, notice something important about this case. Assuming that the subject is right about the doxastic efficacy of her belief, she also has a reason counting in favor of P's truth. In this case, it is the believer's own mental state that will by hypothesis make P more likely. Her belief then is evidence that P. Sometimes beliefs are doxastically efficacious, and when they are, having the belief and being aware of their efficacy is itself evidence for the belief's truth. This is so weird, but like I'm trying to think of how would this work. Say I have a crush on a girl, and I don't realize I have a crush on a girl because that's what happens. Like you're like, oh wait, I do like this person. And then all of a sudden when I realize I do, that evidence that I have reinforces my knowledge or my crush on the girl, and therefore I somehow that makes it even that's a self-reinforcing state. Does that make sense? I mean, is that knowledge or is that just figuring out my own mental state? And then like, okay, well now I know what I was thinking. I mean, how could that actually work in the world? I'm not sure yet. Yeah. So, but this is the funny thing. I want to like write that down. That was a funny thought. So like, seriously, you'd be like, does knowing I am horny matter? Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. Like, but this is what's at issue here. So, like, but like that's kind of what's going on. Like, what is this sort of instance in which when you believe something and then you know you believe it, like that actually, like, or like there's knowing self-induction. When the heck does like that make it more likely that it's true? Because like at that point it is going to build on itself. Okay. However, there are problems with both parts of this strategy. First of all, while James was always fascinated by cases in which faith in a fact can help create the fact. That's exactly what this is. Like knowing that you're horny, does that make you more horny? His statement of his views in the will to believe never brings this factor in as something that should be required in addition to the questions representing an evidentially undermined option. Shane asks, does that imply that I can believe something I don't know I believe? There's different sort of feelings on this. Like sometimes, yeah, like it can actually be a thing. Like then again, it depending on how you slice up like the meanings of belief and know. A lot of times people don't want to say you know things, but then you like if you like you don't know you know them. But yeah, like in some sense you may kind of have them in like the back of your head and you didn't actually realize it. You weren't like conscious of it. So, you know, like a sort of unconscious belief. I think most people are okay with that. Yeah, then the philosophers I'm sure have something to say about it, but like they might say that's not really a belief, but if you're gonna use a wide version of it, like I think most people have accepted that there is like some sort of like in the back of your head psychologically, unconsciously. Yeah. Yeah, like you were saying earlier, like biases, like racism and things, like you can believe stuff like that. And I think most people, I mean, unless you're talking to philosophers who have a very specific, like narrow view of this, would agree that this is a thing, that you can believe something, but you don't know you believe it. Okay, doxastically efficacious cases may be ones in which James takes passional belief to be justified as well, but it's much more plausible to think that the cases he views the contribution of a passional nature to be justified to be a union rather than an intersection of these two sets of cases. After all, given that James' endgame for the will to believe is a justification for religious faith, if his view really were that we were only entitled to believe in God if God's existence depended on our believing in him, then his view would provide very cold comfort to the would-be religious believer. Yeah, see, there's definitely a religious flavor to this. Like your belief in God is what makes God's existence more real to you in some sense. But again, if that's all it took, if it was just that the fact that you could believe it and then not believe it, then that would be cold comfort to the religious believer. Because in some sense, if you ever just lost that belief, it would just, all of religion would just be gone like that. Cryonic says, can I say I believe something that I know I don't believe if I don't know I believe that I know it? Yes. Sure, say whatever the hell you want, Cryonics. It's cool. I know. So, yeah, say whatever the hell. But yeah, so the funny part about God and what the author's point, I just want to make this clear, is that if all it took was belief and you could like turn it on and off, then that's not good for God. I can tell when I'm reading things that like they're trying to trip me up, because I read like real time all the time. I'm like, Cryonics is trying to trip me up here, and I'm still reading this. I know it's screwing with me, which is fine. Feel free to screw with me if you want. Yeah. So that's the question. There has to be something else in your experience, like a religious experience, that would underpin your belief in God. Otherwise, the belief seems like something you could lose too easily, and then that's not good for religion. This brings us to the second part of the internal argument, the assumption that the relevant beliefs are, for James, reflective. Actually, yeah, I just want to say that's the difference between the God case and me being horny. There's a excited state, like there's a state of being horny, but like you need a religious experience to, you need a religious excitation for the belief in God, and that would be something more over and above just the knowledge of your belief. This brings us to the second part of the internal argument, the assumption that the relevant beliefs are, for James, reflective. That is, the relevant believers are consciously aware of the effect that their believing has on the truth of their beliefs. It is admittedly tempting to understand doxastically efficacious cases like this, and many of presentations of James' mountain climber describe him in just this way. And the mountain climber was being confident in that you could jump over it, the gap, gave you the extra belief that you could, which actually helped you jump over the gap. The mountain climber jump over some gap. However, when we look at James' own description of such cases, such reflections seem entirely absent. The climber is only described as having hope and confidence that he will succeed, and he never goes through any reflection about how this confidence will help get him across. Further, even if James' believers were reflective, it's hard to say why this would be enough to make the cases fit the evidentialist model. James describes cases where confidence makes success more likely, and perhaps even cases where confidence is necessary for success, but for the reflective cases to fit the evidentialist model, one's confidence would need to make one's success highly likely, and James never describes belief as being that effective. Indeed, for the cases that James often focuses on, such as, say, whether the good will ultimately triumph over evil, knowing that you can contribute to the outcome is a far cry from knowing that one's confidence can assure it. I mean, lack of confidence can almost always ensure failure in certain times, though. So maybe there is something to that, but it's definitely not what was being said. Like, lack of confidence can, like, sticking with the dating example, lack of confidence when talking to someone you're interested in can be a major turnoff. And so that one may be more of an example here. Like, a lack of belief can cause failure, whereas the belief is necessary but not sufficient. Yeah, it will not assure it. Our belief may nudge things in the direction we want, but to meet the evidentialist standard, we would need much more than a nudge. Even worse, for the reflective reading of James, reflection on the doxastic efficacy of one's belief only helps to meet the evidentialist standard if one has evidence for this efficacy, while one may now have evidence for this in athletic cases, such as a mountain climber. James' central concern was religious belief, and while he certainly thought that such efficacy was possible in the religious cases, he never suggests that we have evidence for it being so. Shane says, so here's the thing. I can be confident that I know something, and I can be completely wrong. If that fact exists, should that bring uncertainty about everything I know? Alright, so this is actually a radical skepticism. Like, if you are really confident in something, like I'm sitting here right now, and I could be completely wrong about that, should that bring uncertainty about everything I know? I mean, I would say yes. I mean, I don't have doubt that I'm sitting here right now, so I don't have to worry about that. Now, what exactly do you mean by the fact that, like, you could be just the simple fact that you could be completely wrong about that? Most people, I should say, would actually say yes, that it does bring uncertainty. The modal possibility that things could be completely different than how you understand them to be, they do take this as a skeptical challenge to knowledge. This is a form of kind of skepticism that undermines all the things that you could know. I don't buy it personally. Like I said, I don't have a doubt that I'm sitting here right now, so I don't have this problem myself. But so I don't think it should. But the fact that people can imagine, like, very, very radical scenarios, like, like the Matrix style, where this is all a computer simulation, or Descartes' evil genius, where they're just making our mind think it, or a brain in the vat, our mind is thinking this. Could that undermine knowledge? Yes, but it's these very radical ones. I mean, you could take some solace that they are really far away from everyday reality. Could there be levels of certainty? Philosophers discuss levels of certainty all the time. They think there are. And there are, this is how people, do insurance. So cryonics, basically, if you were very nervous about something, you make insurance this expensive, but if you are less nervous about something, you make the insurance only this expensive. And so it's not even like theoretical. This is where the money is. Shane says, for example, I was convinced that my friend's sister was named Julie, and I would have bet my life on it, but her name is Julianne. Yeah, but Shane, the difference between Julie and Julianne is really small. Like, someone may have even called her Julie for a while you were around her, just to shorten the name. So, like, you may have even bet your life on that her name was Julie, but really, would you have? Like, the idea that it wasn't Julianne, like it was just a nickname. So, is that the sort of thing that you bet your life on? That'd be a very dangerous thing, to bet your life on that sort of stuff. Now, the question is, things like nicknames exist, but, like, would you bet your life on how many fingers you have on your hands? Like, that's slightly different, because that's not a matter of convention. Like, what people are called is a matter of convention, and you can hear it a lot of times. You can't use metaphors in philosophy class? What? Of course you can use metaphors. I mean, you're going to have a harder time slipping one by me. But like, howdy, Richard. Hope you're doing well. Welcome in. We discuss philosophy. Well, I read philosophy papers and we discuss this stuff here. I was certain with as much certitude as I could manage. Yeah, well, there's, again, as Cryonics was just saying, there are levels of certainty here. Yeah, see, you don't think you'd bet your life on it. Yeah, but see, I'd bet my life on that people are generally born with 5 fingers on their hands. Like, that isn't a dangerous bet to me. Like, that's just not dangerous at all. And so, you might have bet a lot of money that her name was Julie and not Julianne, but you wouldn't bet your life on it. And so even at that point, you would have understood that there's good bets and bad bets. And so there's the questions like, but there is like, that actually has a measurable level of doubt. And so would that undermine everything? No. But like, if you were to bet like on like number of fingers on your hand, not even your hand, just average person hand, is generally 5. And so it's like, you can still, there's still wiggle room there. You just have to get a little bit more creative with your philosophical examples. Yeah. So like, what do you want to undermine is the other question. Like, things of convention like names. That, like, seriously, you can undermine that sort of thing. Now, no matter how many times you're going to hear someone's name, that doesn't mean it's not going to be a nickname. Yes, you can. I'm probably done after this one, Richard, for tonight. But if you put it in the hopper, I'll probably be back Wednesday night, and I can get to it then, if you'd like. But I'm definitely, I can't really talk for more than 3 hours, so this is going to be it. So 2.5 is where I'm going to cut it tonight. I wasn't suggesting it was yours. I'll read basically anything. I don't care. Like, I read published things. Oh, Phil Sci PhD. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, I personally like philosophy of science quite a bit. I just had a paper published on epistemology myself. So, yeah. But yeah, you can stuff. Thank you. The only thing I ask is that it's basically less than 20 pages. I have to read on the shorter side because otherwise I start losing my mind. But yeah. Cool. Yeah, so Shane, you let me know if like I've answered your question or if you got more on that. Like, what are you really going to get undermined when you're talking about conventional things versus non-conventional things? Anywho, okay. So yeah, and Richard, feel free to ask questions, whatever. We're just going through this thing on William James and his version and how we understand what he takes as evidence for knowledge. And the question is knowing something or knowing that you believe something, does that count as evidence for it? Okay. Yeah, our beliefs may nudge things in the direction we want, but to meet the evidentialist standard we would need much more than that. Even worse for the reflective reading of James, reflection on the doxastic efficacy of one's belief only helps one meet the evidentialist standard if one has evidence for this efficacy, and while we may now have evidence for this in athletic cases, such as the mountain climber, James' central concern was religious belief, and while he certainly thought that such efficacy was possible in the religious case, he never suggests that we have evidence for that being so. Yeah, what kind of thing would actually be evidence for God? Just the fact that you believe it would not make it true. Shane says, I think my larger point was that if there is doubt, should we apply it across the board or selectively? I mean, I would say selectively. Because, like, there's a big difference between what someone is called and then other facts that seem to be a lot more secure in this world. Like, what people are called changes over time. People change your name. I mean, I don't even know if your name is actually Shane McInnes. It's just what you claim your name is in Twitch. Like, my name is written in the description below, but I go by Noger all the time online. So it's like, that's not the sort of thing that's fixed. But, like, yeah. And so there is doubt, but like, where is there doubt? And how much doubt is there? So if you want to do the radical skepticism, but fine, of like Descartes, that's fine. But again, what does that matter in the day-to-day life? And then like you only have to worry about it in like very weird times. Alright, it seems then that while one's awareness of one's being in a doxastically efficacious case could be used to make some new evidence available, there's little reason to think that this sort of evidence is what is being appealed to in the will to believe. The external argument, the duty to believing James' duel with Chauncey Wright. The external argument for the expansive reading requires us to go back to the very start of James's academic career. One natural reason for thinking that James wasn't any sort of evidentialist was that he typically expressed his view in terms of having a right to believe beyond what the evidence compelled us to. Richard Printersale says, "My 2 cents is that evidence is always evidence for. Are beliefs inherently evidence? No. Can beliefs play an evidentiary role? Maybe in some cases. It feels contextually determined for me." Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I think the author is saying here, too, is that, look, maybe the belief that you can jump over, and this is a William James example, that you can jump over a gap plays into the role, into the fact that you can do it. So with the belief that you can do it, it gives you the confidence to actually jump the gap. So maybe it does, but they're saying that's not enough outside of some very selective cases. Shane says, "I think I end up erring on the side of too much doubt out of fear of not using enough." Yeah, Shane, you're in the smart person's trap. The people who know things are filled with doubt, and the idiots are filled with confidence. Yeah, that old quote. It's what it is. By the way, since we may have some new people here, yeah, that's a Bertrand Russell quote. Shane is a fantastic streamer who does, Dunning-Kruger. Shane does sociology and history, and mostly on his channel he does history and makes models of like Gundams. But yeah, you should go check out Shane McGinnis. If anyone doesn't know Shane, he's really good. Top-notch stuff when he did the history of Ukraine to actually explain what the hell's going on nowadays. So he has that video, I think, on his YouTube. So if anyone doesn't know Shane, please go check out Shane. Oh yeah. So yeah, and Richard, what the overlay says, if I know I'm horny, does that make me hornier? And like, this is the thing, like, just believing that you're horny, maybe that does actually make you hornier. And so the sort of example I came up with, because, well, I thought it was funny, but I was trying to think of any time when a belief actually will make it true. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so James believed that you have a right to believe beyond what the evidence compelled us to. So, indeed, he later suggested that the right to believe would have been a more appropriate title for his paper. So it's like the warrant to believe. Interesting. Then, so you can believe more than you are warranted. However, if he really was an expansive evidentialist, we wouldn't expect this sort of permissive talk. If our subjective preference really were a sort of evidence, it would seem as if we would have not just a right to believe in accordance with them, but an actual duty to do so. Consequently, on the expansive evidentialist reading, one should expect James to think that we had a duty to believe what was in our interest. So there's a really good point, and I don't know if it's like 100% clear to you folks, but the whole point is that if you had an expansive belief in what you could actually do, you wouldn't need to say that you could believe more than that, because that would always be included in what you were supposed to believe to begin with. Shane says, sociology would call this an interaction between stereotyped threat and embodied identity. If I get stereotyped into something, I can adopt that as part of who I am and become that. Oh yeah, that's a good point. This is like a typecast for an actor. Someone can, become that sort of character all the time. Dretsky, yeah, reasons can become causes. Yeah, that's right too. Like, so you can talk yourself into things. You have a reason, and then it becomes a cause for other stuff. But like, this is the weird part about what's going on here, is that like you're talking about truth and knowledge, and you can't really believe yourself into making the world some way it is. And that's really what's going on, is like, can you believe yourself into, like, can you have enough belief to make the world a certain way? And you can see why someone would kind of want this for a religious case, but every other case seems really weird. Now, in what your example, Shane and Richard, is that once you can embody something and do something, and that makes it true. But that's not how. That's more than your belief. At one point, does perception become reality? Who the fuck knows, Shane? We do a lot of stuff that like, we don't know. Like, a lot of sometimes it seems easy, and sometimes it ain't. Essayist Perkipi. This is the old thing from, who was that? Help me out, Aris, if I can't remember. That was the old consequentialist. It's seeing is believing. Is that, like, really yeah, like, I don't know. When does perception become reality? That's a really hard question to draw that line. Yeah, I think it might have been Bentham. That, like, is seeing believing, and, like, does that, like, make the reality the way it is? Like, do your beliefs correspond to just how you perceive the world? Tree fall in the forest, does it make a sound? I don't know. That's also one of the thing about illusions. So is that a duck or a rabbit? And so it's always really hard to draw that line, and what's going on is not clear at the moment. This is one of these contemporary problems. Like, we've got so much, bad media nowadays, and when does it actually correspond to things in the world? Like, contemporary problem. I have no damn clue. Richard says, like, literal physiological perception is of the real world, but theoretical frameworks, the Kuhnian paradigms, shape how we categorize the phenomena we observe. Again, just my 2 cents. Yeah, see, this is a definite major perspective in philosophy, that we're somehow getting veridical information through our senses, but then we interpret it in different ways. I don't buy that at all, actually. I don't think what we get through our senses is the physiological perception is of the real. I don't think that actually holds, but, like, it makes perfect sense. It's sort of the Kantian view of the world, that you get information and then you interpret it through your concepts. Like, that seems stupid obvious to most people, that, like, that's what's going on. I don't actually hold that, but, like, it's, like, a very normal view. Shane says, perceptual neuroscience is pretty clear. Yes and no. I have a lot of problems with how neuroscience is interpreted nowadays, but that's fine. We can get into that some other time if we want to go over details. Shane says, so here's an example. If I believe that people on the other side of an idea are a certain way, and I act as if they do, and because they respond to what I do, assuming that they are becoming what I assume, did my belief affect the truth? Well, your belief affected how they behaved, and then they, and then, like, the way they behaved, then they started to embody it. But it wasn't just your belief ahead of time making it the way. The belief affected how they behaved. It seems like there's a second step, and that's an important intermediary step, that they weren't necessarily the way you believed, but then they started acting that way because of how you acted towards them by believing a certain thing. So there's, like, intermediary things going on right there, Shane, that I think matter. Like, I think it really matters. It wasn't just the belief. It was them reacting to how you were treating them, or how they were reacting to how they think you were treating them, at least. And so it's a sort of a reaction to that. It's not the belief on its own. It was other people's reaction to your beliefs. So it wasn't the belief doing it. It was something else. The perceptual neuroscience is you're getting something from the world. I'm not exactly sure what. And where you're stopping the measurement of what counts as what you're getting in is not clear to me. Hawthorne Effect. Is that what it's called? Okay, cool. I didn't know that. What was that? Okay. All right. So, yeah, if you have more questions, keep asking. I mean, being observed changes what you do. Oh, damn straight it does, Shane. People have, like, very deep seated, like, biology, I think, about being observed. Like, evolutionarily, based. Oh, yes, okay. That's what the Hawthorne is? Oh, okay. Yeah. One of my favorite recent experiments is not, well, it's maybe in the last 10 years. Yeah, see, I didn't know. I didn't know what the Hawthorne effect was. That squirrels, squirrels, if they are being observed by other squirrels, they will fake hide their nuts. They will pretend to hide their nuts, but not hide their nuts up to 5 times before actually like giving up and just hiding their nuts if they think another squirrel is observing them. But they will not fake hide their nuts if they're being observed by people. They know the difference between being observed by another squirrel who will steal their nuts and people who will not steal the squirrel's nuts. And this came out maybe in the last 10 years. So like even squirrels will, change their behavior on whether or not they're being observed by squirrels. I love that. Okay. It is then not surprising that the claim that James had at some deeper level a commitment to some sort of duty to believe view has a number of supporters among defenders of the expansive reading. And Mizak has argued that James was aware of the commitment himself. She made a case for this by placing a lot of emphasis on the one occasion where James did seem to explicitly put forward a duty to believe view, namely his unsigned 1875 review of Tate and Stewart's The Unseen Universe in the Nation, where James claims that if a belief in the supernatural order was evidentially underdetermined, then anyone to whom it makes a practical difference, whether of motion to action or mental peace, is in duty bound to it. Cheryl Mizak, this who's being referenced here. Of course, giving a single line in a short anonymous book review written before he published any of his main philosophical or even psychological works, precedence over all the more considered views presented in his later philosophical writings would take some justification, but Mizak argues that we can find this justification in Chauncey Wright's account of his encounter with James after the publication of the 1875 Nation Review. Oh, a friend of a friend, cool. On this reading, James, in his heart of hearts, always clung to something like the duty to believe view, but drew back from it in print because he was bullied by an onslaught of criticism from Wright, and this early tussle supports an interpretation of the will to believe in which the point is to expand the scope of evidence so as to include the consequences that a belief has on one's life. I mean, to be fair, things like prayer, things like belief that you're thinking about a lot will add up in your life and will make a difference in your life. Does that mean it will correspond to some truth in the world? I don't know, but maybe it will change you enough that, as we're saying, your interactions with the world will change, and maybe that will show you different truths. So maybe in some sense having a belief will show you certain truths, and maybe some of those will be aligned. Like if you believe in God, you will find evidence of God, but again, that doesn't really tell you how the world is. That tells you what you will find. So I don't know. Mizak argues that James' true intention can be seen in the account that Wright gives of their duel in his letter to Grace Norton, the relevant portion of which runs as follows. I have carried out my purpose of giving Dr. James the 2 lectures I had in store for him. I found him just returned home on Wednesday evening. His father remarked in the course of talk that he had not found any typographical errors in William's article. I said that I had read it with interest and had not noticed any typographical errors. The emphasis attracted the youth's attention and made him demand an explanation, which was my premeditated discourse. He fought vigorously, not to say manfully, but confessed to having written under irritation. On Friday evening, I saw him again and introduced the subject of duty of belief, as advocated by him in The Nation. He retracted the word duty. All that he meant to say was that is foolish not to believe or try to believe if one is happier for believing. But even so, he seemed to me to be more Epicurean, though he hates the sect, than even the utilitarians would allow to be wise. He quite agrees that evidence is all that enforces the obligation of belief, and that it does this only in virtue of its own force as evidence. Belief is only a matter of choice, and therefore a moral duty, so far as attending to evidence is a volitional act. And he agreed that attention to all accessible evidence was only duty involved in belief. According to Mizek, while James altered his position in light of this onslaught and switched his talk to duty to talk of right, the fact that he had to be bullied into doing so is significant and puts the anti-evidentialist interpretation into question. And it is kind of fair, but then again, it sounds more like James was a little confused. However, when we look at Wright's letters more closely, we see that far from revealing James' original intent, an intent that he fought vigorously, if unsuccessfully, to maintain in the face of Wright's criticism, the talk of duty in his 1875 review was never particularly important to James, and that the right to believe doctrine was always more central to him. In particular, Wright's letter describes 2 days of debate with James, a Wednesday then a Friday, and while Mizek presents this all being about the duty of belief, a more extensive examination of Wright's correspondence shows this not to be the case. We see a sign of this in the initial letter quoted above, when Wright claims that he only introduced the subject of the duty of belief on the Friday, suggesting that the vigorous debate 2 days before was about something else entirely, a suggestion reinforced by the letter's opening line, where he claimed to have had 2 lectures in store for James. Okay, so basically they're saying the big claim was really an afterthought there. So what else could their Wednesday debate have been about? Fortunately, Wright answers this question himself in another letter, also to Grace Norton, written 6 days earlier, in which he writes, Cryonics says, "We have all made mistakes. I disagree with your first premise." Well, Cryonics, some people are better than me. I was using a royal we. I know, I'm sorry. I apologize for... you can see I made a mistake. So, I'm imperfect and I made a mistake, so you'll have to forgive me. And with your perfection, I'm sure you will, because being perfectly forgiving is a perfection that I'm sure you have. So, this is the earlier letter. And thank you for downloading my paper. As everyone can see in the chat right there, this is my paper. You can click on it and see what I have to say about epistemology. Thank you, Cryonics. I appreciate that. When Dr. Williams James gets back from his journeys, I shall have 2 bones to pick with him. One we have, that is, you and I have, talked about and happily agreed upon, namely his doctrine in the nation about the duty of belief. The other is in a book notice by him in the North American Review of Wundt's Physiopsychology. Oh, William Wundt, interesting. In a paragraph in which he distinguishes and compliments me among the empiricists, he has so badly misapprehended what the experience philosophy in general holds and teaches that the compliment to me goes for nothing in mitigation of my resentment. That's funny. This letter makes it clear that Wright's attention was caught not just by James' review in the Unseen Universe, but also by his review of Wundt's 1875 Grundzüge der... I can't read German, I apologize, whatever this thing is by Wundt. In that review, he speaks favorably of Wright, but is generally critical of the experience philosophy for treating experience as too passive. It seems like that it is this latter article on empiricism, and not the one of the duty to believe, that Wright tells James contains no typographical errors, and about which the two engaged in such vigorous debate on Wright's initial Wednesday visit to the James household. This is clear not only from the fact that Wright claims to have introduced the subject of the duty to believe on the Friday, but also by Wright's description of Wednesday debate, which includes a line omitted by Mizek, where Wright claims that James referred to the compliment to him in that article, to which Wright rejoined, "made at the expense of my friends." There is no compliment or mention of Wright in the review of Tate, but there is a clear compliment of Wright in the Wundt review, and as we saw in his letter of July 12th, Wright did not particularly appreciate it. Okay, so we got a timeline going here. With the Wednesday debate taken up by the reviewer Vunt, the entire duel over the duty to believe must be found in their Friday meeting, but the description of that day's debate doesn't really provide any evidence that James was particularly attracted to the duty to believe view. When Wright questions James about the use of duty, James shows no real concern with defending that terminological choice at all, giving it up with no apparent fight and saying only that all he meant to say was that it is foolish not to believe or to try to believe if one is happier for believing. This phrasing suggests that James is not admitting to any change of mind on this issue, rather he is only admitting that what he wrote did not aptly capture what he had originally had in mind. This suggests that the original intent behind James' 1875 review corresponds roughly to his later doctrine that, even if it isn't a duty, it is part of the wisdom to believe what it is in one's interest in such evidentially underdetermined cases. Okay, so it looks like he don't care. Further, on question of our having a right to believe in these cases, Wright seems to have been brought around to James' side, if he wasn't there already, writing Norton that at the end of the Friday debate, I allowed that unproved beliefs unfounded in evidence were not only allowable, but were sometimes even fit, becoming, or appropriate to states of feeling or types of character, which are deserving of approval or even honor. This fitness does not, however, amount to an obligation or duty. It seems then that Wright was, in allowing the legitimacy of beliefs that were unfounded in evidence, ultimately willing to join James in his rejection of evidentialism. Conclusion. The debate between evidentialists and pragmatists is still very much alive in epistemology today, and while I haven't focused here on the strength of James' arguments against evidentialism, I hope to have at least shown that he was a precursor to our more contemporary critics of the view, and not just an evidentialist with an unduly expansive conception of what the evidence was. Okay, very nice. This was a bit of fun compared to the previous philosophy of knowledge paper. Because you get into like a little argument here, you get a little history, a little shake and bake, you know? Because this is more fun. We got some shake and bake. We got this argument here, which basically said, look, it doesn't make sense to say that just because you believe it, that's how the world is. And even if the religious belief that James was arguing for, that doesn't give you what you want in religious knowledge. So if you're still here, Richard Pinterest, Printer Sales, Cheryl Mizak. This is actually Cheryl. So this was a little shake and bake. I like this. You're getting some history, you got some argumentation, and then at the end you say, hey, look, this is a precursor to modern stuff, we're still arguing over this, so that's why it's a nice historical contribution to the discussion. Anyone have any other questions on these things? My voice is starting to go. I don't talk anywhere near as much during my normal days as when I'm streaming. You dig it. Thank you, Shane. I mean, I think, there's different kinds of paper, different kinds of journals. And so it's funny, even though some of the fancy journals write very technical, like boring philosophy, it's good philosophy, but it's just, I like a little bit more shake and bake in my philosophy. So, got history, you got argumentation, we're talking about like early psychologists, things like that.